Hello, hello, and welcome to Tea with Halo, the podcast of the Enchanted Academy. I am Halo Quinn. I'm an author, storyteller, and a witch. And if you're watching this on video, you can see I am in a bluebell woods, which is not far from where I am, because the landscape, the plant world, the place that we are inhabiting is already enchanted, even though I like to say my mission is to re-enchant the world. Now, part of that is to actually bring people together, bring people into your space that can talk about that space of remembering that the world is enchanted, or however they'd like to phrase it. So that is what we're here to do today. Today, I have with me an author, magician, a magical person who I've delighted to have met in person a couple of times, and I'm very much looking forward to our conversation because he has very different background to me in many ways. So I'm excited for what we can learn together today. So without further ado, Julian Vayne, please introduce yourself to our listeners.
Hello, thank you very, very much. Thank you for inviting me here to have tea with you. It's very nice. So by way of introduction, so my name's Julian Vayne. I'm a kink positive, bisexual, working class, 56-year-old male, cis-presenting male from Stevenage in Hertfordshire. And I'm a psychedelic occultist, amongst other things. So I kind of got involved in magical practice as a kid. Probably when I should be doing more climbing trees, I found myself poring over anything I could find in the library. I had several years of copying out everything I could conceivably find that was a piece of operative magic, and immerse myself in that whole thing, so that and some of it fairly early, and possibly in a way that at an age that was we might these days describe as inappropriate. So I remember reading John Simmons' schlock biography of Aleister Crowley at the age of 10, which was in my local library, which is quite an eye-opener in many respects. Very interesting book. And then devouring everything else I could find, the works of Sybil Leek, for example, and found myself particularly engaged in Wicca. That was my first point of access to the magical world, particularly to kind of group magical practice. So I'd done yoga and I'd done meditation and I'd done every experiment that I could find in the book. I'd been doing dowsing and looking for UFOs and just generally interested in all the weird things, really. So I became involved in hanging out at various kind of magical festivals and gatherings, and found my way into a Wiccan coven when I was 16. Worked in that coven for quite a number of years. It was an eclectic magical system rooted in an Alexandrian tradition, but very kind of experimental. And worked with that group for a number of years, then found myself working with a whole variety of different styles of magical practice, things like Druidry, things like Thelema, and ceremonial, Western ceremonial magic, I guess we could call it. And then from there, I suppose, exploring more and more things that I guess might be described as shamanism in some respects. And in particular, kind of about, what is it now, 25 years ago, something like this, becoming actively involved in a chaos magic order, practicing within that space, but also practicing with other people as well, being very interested in group practice, collaborative practice. That's really what I enjoy. And then really, I suppose, over that sort of period, over the last sort of 20, 30 years, something like this, working more and more, exploring altered states of consciousness, particularly in relation to pharmacology, so specifically psychedelics. And so these days, I do lots of writing, I do lots of teaching, fair amount of mentoring for people, people interested in working with psychedelics, and also people interested in their spiritual practice, I guess we could call it. And I write things. I've written, I don't know how many books, I think it's like 15 or something like this. But a lot of those books are co-authored with other people because I like collaboration. I like working with others. And, you know, I've helped set up and run various organizations and zines and things over yeah, a few years. So that's me in a nutshell. Is that enough?
I always wonder, why is it a nutshell? Why not an eggshell?
I guess because I always imagine that the nutshell is a hazelnut. So
Mm.
it's a magical hazelnut that might drop into a pool in which a salmon might dwell. And I imagine that it's quite a small thing. Hazelnut's relatively small, isn't it? So
Yeah,
that's what I always imagine. But I don't know. If it was coconut, I suppose it'd be a bit bigger.
that is very true. Or and then there's the difference between a wren's egg and an ostrich's egg. You
Indeed.
know, some of us can squeeze down into a wren's egg and then hatch into the Lord of the Birds. So that's like a fascinating journey to have been on. And there are pieces in there that I recognize very much, also finding my way into magic quite young and finding the books that I could get off the shelves and the some of them not being what we would consider entirely appropriate nowadays for a 10, 11-year old. But that journey then that took you into working with the Wiccan coven at 16.
Mm.
Yeah. So how did that then shift the space from your magical adventures from being more solo into to being with others? Like what happened when you stepped through that doorway?
I suppose for me, as a kid, I grew up in a space where my family weren't particularly they weren't religious. My mum has a little bit of an interest in spiritualism and sort of alternative stuff, but very very vaguely. It's not central to her life, and so I grew, and because of the town in which I grew up, it was a town that was essentially for displaced people who'd been bombed out of the East End of London, more or less. And so in a way, it had this kind of strange mixture of bland suburban sprawl, but also this kind of really ancient little village at its heart, surrounded by wasteland, which would soon be built on. And so there was a sense of, I don't necessarily think that I felt sort of isolated, but I was, I was on my own. But fortunately, particularly as I got into secondary school, I found some friends who were interested in doing weird magic rituals in the woods. And then it was a kind of a natural graduation from that point, I suppose. Um, I'm very, I'm very, very interested in the idea of the relationality of magic. You speak about this the Weberian disenchantment of the world and the re-enchantment thereof. And part of the thing for me, I suppose, with magic is this: it's about a kind of a recognition, as much as it's about like some sense of control. It's a sensitivity and an ability to listen as well as to speak and to act. And so for me, coming into contact with all of those other kind of practitioners was a real delight. And I wasn't, I don't think, particularly naive in the sense that I'd already read the story of Aleister Crowley by a not terribly flattering biographer. So I wasn't expecting to find a bunch of saints or a bunch of um, uh, holy people who were without blemish. But what I did find was I found a very, very interesting, very rich, very engaging in many respects kind of community. Um, and so, I spent quite a lot of years, doing things like, I ran a zine in the 90s, which I think probably is certainly got to the point where we were doing 1,000 copies a month, so it was quite a big deal,
On
really.
the photocopier, on the Xerox machine.
No, we were having it printed.
I
We
mean,
had, it was initially, yes, initially it was a photocopied zine, and then it graduated to being sort of officially, but printed, and this is, we're talking sort of analog pre-internet kind of days, or so. Um, I've always been interested in the idea of collaboration. I've always been interested in the idea of relationality. You in that with that beautiful photograph of the woodland behind you. So a lot of, for me, magic is this emergent property of the relationship that we have with, for example, a special piece of woodland. Mm. And so it's that relationship that I find particularly kind of interesting. And so yeah, working with other people was a great adventure, and I've been very fortunate in as much as I've worked doing ceremony with all kinds of different people. you know, from, I guess, what we could call sort of traditional or indigenous lineages through to, you know, syncretic religious systems through to experimental, you know, avant-garde punk installation-y art things, you know, and I like it all. So, you know, in the same way that I quite like Italian food and I quite like, you know, a roast dinner, and I quite like Chinese food and a curry, you know. So I want the diversity and I want the relationality and I want that richness in my life. And I'm very pleased to have had quite a lot of that in the, you know, few decades that I've been knocking around.
There's a piece in that relationality that, so I love the way you talk about that, moving through what we probably call shamanism, right? And when you say that, I'm imagining something similar to what I encountered, which is like the core shamanism stuff that was slightly decontextualized, rather decontextualized into tools, and then of course, hopefully finding then the context and the indigenous, like those roots that we'd apply it from. Um, but is that
It just
fair?
it just makes me think. Okay, so hallucinogens and shamanism, a
Yeah,
great book of essays, including things like essays by Michael Harner. There's one called "The Sound of Running Water," which I think is his. So the interesting thing about Michael Harner is Michael Harner basically goes to South America, takes a big load of ayahuasca, gets like hip to shamanism, comes back with like a drum and says, "Hey guys, let's all do drumming," which is cool. You know, we like that. We like that. Um, However, the ayahuasca might have been an important component, and this is one of the things I know we were discussing a moment ago before we hit record, which is this thing to do with the relationship between pharmacology and altering consciousness through drugs, essentially, and magical practice. And certainly, echoing the thoughts we were sharing earlier, when I first got into magic, so this is like, by which I mean working with groups of people doing practice, um, there was the kind of cultural backwash of the 1960s and 1970s, but we're talking really about the sort of I guess the early 80s. Yeah, is when I first pop into the world of covens and people doing ceremonies together and whatever. And by and large, even though Wicca sort of presented itself as a cult of ecstasy, in many respects, if you go and have a look at the way the charge is framed, um, uh, this particular movement, its primary way of changing awareness, or one of its primary ways, was the use of things like sort of dance, ritual drama, poetry. Those were what it majored in, basically. Maybe sort of breath techniques and so on. But there was a whole limb of the eightfold wheel of power marked sort of drugs that we don't really talk about, the sort of disreputable, the seventh ray or whatever it is, I can't think. But, so if we look at the example of Michael Harner, you can totally see in the latter part of the 20th century, in the shadow of the war on drugs, which is unfortunately still going on, a war on drugs, how insane is that? So Michael Harner goes back from South American shamanism to the States, essentially, and starts teaching a thing. He can't teach, he can't bring with him, literally or figuratively, the fact that the pharmacology of ayahuasca, which, these days, here in the sort of 21st century, is spoken about a lot. People listening to this, watching this, probably might have heard the term, even if they don't know much about this potion. But that's an important part of the whole storyline for me, and certainly for the last, I guess, 30 years, I guess it is. I've been really, really interested in that side of things, partly because that's also about a relationship. It's about a relationship between an individual or a group of people and a plant, a fungus, or a practice that radically changes consciousness. And as someone who's interested in magic, a lot of magic seems to me to pivot on the ability to play with awareness, to explore awareness, to And those experiments can be done in all kinds of different ways. And one way they can be done is with substances.
Yeah. I also probably about 10 years after the point that you're talking about, like that limb was very much still marked do not touch, right? It was the, oh yeah, and that was something that fascinated me, was altered states of consciousness and how trance work, how the drumming work, how when we do magic we're shifting through those states, we're journeying, we're connecting with beings and relating with beings that are outside of the broadly speaking, like Western modern way of looking at the world, right? Um, and so what the thing that I kept coming across was, well, yes, you'll hear about these substances mentioned in history, but we don't need to do that. We don't need to do that, so we shouldn't. And they're you know, like it's unnecessary and they're out of control. And there was this whole piece about staying in control of the process.
I think there are several things there. I mean, firstly, we have in the 20th century, we have a Nietzschean obsession with the will. The idea is that the magician is a person who spends a lot of their time poking their wand up into the sky, shouting at things that probably aren't there. And that's what the magician looks like. They're this sort of iron will kind of character, a little bit iron sort of, you know, it shades off into a kind of a right-wing fascist element that I really don't like, because it becomes something about the kind of an elitism, which is an aspect of our culture that I really dislike.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea is that in the 20th century, we have all this stuff about the will. You know, Dion Fortune talks about it, Aleister Crowley talks about it, like everyone, it's all about like willing terribly hard. And I always imagine clenching one's teeth, you know, like this. And so the idea of this kind of self-possessed magical practitioner who doesn't need all of these props and aids, which is hilarious given the fact that lots of magical practice is about figuring out sometimes physical props and aids, whether those are tarot cards or chords or whatever they happen to be, and then a series of like mental kind of processes. So there's a whole repertoire of technique, but there's a bunch of techniques that you're not allowed to use, even though everybody in the past who you've ever heard of has used them. And if you then look at people like Aleister Crowley is often held up as this kind of, you know, the sort of this dangerous character because he talks about the use of psychedelic and psychoactive substances. He's actually more in the lineage of magic than someone like Dion Fortune, in the sense that if you go back and you go through the history of magic, you know, I've got an essay coming out in a book later on this year called this is in a collection called This is Chaos, where I look at the history of the use of altered states of consciousness through pharmacology in magic. If you want to know why the grimoires, the early modern and medieval grimoires work, what you need to do is you need to look at the ointment that you're supposed to put on, and you need to look at the incense that you're supposed to burn. And then everything else makes complete sense. If you want to understand how a lot of, you know, traditional, you know, slightly imaginal, let's say, wise woman herbalism looks, you have to understand the pharmacology of the plants in the environments in which that we're talking about. You know, these are powerful things. And the reason that you encountered that 20th century, late 20th century, early 21st century kind of argument about we shouldn't touch these things is nothing to do with the magical tradition. It's everything to do with contemporary politics, prohibition, and Richard Nixon's war on drugs, you know, which is primarily a political device in order to get rid of the women's rights movement, the civil rights movement, the anti-Vietnam movement, and the terrible prospect of black people and white people sitting down at a music festival having a thoroughly lovely time. So, yes, of course, I too encountered this. I guess I was kind of inoculated, if you like, inadvertently by John Simmons with Aleister Crowley. You know, with Aleister Crowley, these terrible. I mean, it wasn't very appealing. You know, terrible stories of like, you know, heroin, cocaine, and trying to wrestle with these addictions and so on. But if you take something like frankincense, you know, as an example, frankincense, commonly used incense ingredient. Frankincense in high dose will change your awareness measurably. You know, it is in every meaningful sense of the term, at the appropriate dose, like anything, like many things, it's a drug. It's a way of altering awareness. Even the very fact that for many practitioners, myself included, possibly you just have to burn frankincense and suddenly you go, oh, I'm entering the circle, right? So,
yeah, well, and it's the same with tea. right?
Indeed.
Black
Absolutely.
tea is caffeinated. Caffeine shifts your state of consciousness. It might not necessarily shift it into a way that's conducive to many times, like many forms of magic, but it may shift it into some that are. But there's also obviously like the tisanes and the herbal teas. Mugwort is again mildly it shifts your consciousness, isn't it? So I'm
There's
saying like I don't do I don't do psychedelics, I don't do substances, but actually you're reminding me like all of these things are
Mm.
sort of the same
It's
relationship.
like when people say, "Oh, it's not a alcohol. It's not a drug. It's a drink." It's like, well, no, I think you find it is, and certainly tea. There's a beautiful Chinese poem, early Buddhist Chinese poem about drinking 7 cups of tea in order to stay awake to do more meditation, right? And the other thing, of course, is I mentioned about this idea of sensitivity. So there's our 20th century magician who's spending all their time willing things terribly hard, and I wonder whether or not part of maybe the sort of the magical uh, an element of the magical culture of the 21st century might be what about actually sensitivity, might be about being able to listen really deeply. So you can get into a situation, you may have done this yourself, where you divest yourself of the stuff you normally deal with, right? Social media, or you keep your diet really simple. You basically go on a sort of retreat. And in a situation like that, if you then have your morning coffee or your morning cup of tea becomes this ecstatic, powerful, sacramental, definitely consciousness changing agent. So some of it is just about how loud it is, right? When we had the pandemic, everyone went, "Oh, aren't the birds very loud?" You can hear the bird song. Interestingly, the bird song across the whole of the country, the whole of the world indeed, was actually quieter because the birds were not having to compete against all of the sound that we make, that our species makes. We make an awful lot of sound.
Yeah.
And also because we'd shut up, we could hear it. So we thought, isn't it loud? It's
Yeah.
no. That's how it should be. Should be. But that's how it is if you listen. So those substances, frankincense, tea, whatever they are, if you can listen to them, you can get a lot from these things. You don't have to take mind-bendingly powerful drugs, although it's great fun if you have the opportunity in a safe and legal setting, ideally.
Yes, yes, of course. Don't do obviously your
Don't,
legalities where you are in different parts of the world where you're listening from will be different. So, bear that in mind. Don't get yourself in trouble unless you really want to. Like, if people want to get themselves in trouble, that's up to them. Yeah, I mean, this is, but to like add a little bit more context from me, I actually went teetotal from the age of 18 to about the age of 21, 22.
mm,
Because there's alcohol problems in family and like culture and what have you. And I hadn't been a big drinker up till that point because obviously I was under 18 and therefore not. But I went teetotal because again that for me there was this element of sort of being in control of what was going on because so many other people were out of control, right?
yeah.
And were out of control in relation to that substance. And so there's this piece in here that I'm curious to hear from you about the way in which our relationship as modern Western, etc., magical practitioners in the culture that we are in, when these substances are considered recreational, when they're not interacted with as relationships, they're used.
Mm, mm, mm.
Like how does that shift? What happens when you engage with them in magic?
Oh, there are so many things we could talk about there. I mean, fundamentally, this is about relationship and the ability to listen to yourself and to your context. So your response by not taking any of these substances that you saw that people were using to harm themselves and their communities or self-medicate in the face of their difficult circumstances, which is generally what's going on.
Yeah.
So
No
your
blame to anyone
no,
that
no, 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 no,
I
no.
was mentioning.
But your decision as a strategy in relation to that makes complete sense, absolute sense, really, really wise strategy. Um, it is fundamentally about relationships. The alcohol that we might use to get drunk at the end of yet another soul crushing day might be the same alcohol that we have in the wine of the communion. It's the same stuff. It's just about attitude. and it's about relationship. And so, tobacco is a great example. So tobacco is probably the principal shamanic herb, really, in many respects, although it doesn't originally come from the area in the sort of Tungus region from which the word shamanism comes, but let's create this kind of inclusive way of using that word, which is quite common. And we can certainly look at, in fact, the practitioners now in that part of the world do make use of tobacco. Tobacco is a really, really important and powerful herb. It's also something that can become a real source of damage. But then the same thing can be said for everything in the world. Oh, this thing could be perfectly nice when you use it well, but do you know what? If you don't use it well, it can be really a problem. I mean, you could say that for scissors.
Yeah.
So,
Or water.
that's self-evident truth.
Yeah.
That's pretty much axiomatic. We can kind of like, okay, let's go beyond that. Let's look at the quality of that relationship. Let's look at sort of how, and let's also not assume that the scissors and the spoon are exactly the same thing, because they're clearly not. So the way that one set of chemicals or drugs or processes work, and the way that another set of things that are the same, they're still things you find in the kitchen drawer, but they are significantly different. So there are various types of substance. Ayahuasca that I alluded to earlier on is, it could conceivably be part of you could have a harmful and difficult relationship with ayahuasca. That's absolutely the case. You probably wouldn't find yourself using it in the same way that you would use alcohol as a way of mitigating your suffering. These substances work in quite different ways. So one of the problems, I suppose, when we sort of address these things, and the reason for reminding ourselves that alcohol is a drug, that tea is a drug, and so on, is to get over this latter part of the 20th century pharmacopophobia, where we're just frightened of all of these things that are all going to just destroy us, which is really interesting because they're, from a magical perspective, they're part of the tradition, and from the point of view of contemporary science, certainly the sort of the work that's been done, frankly, for about 100 years in the West, but particularly rebooted over the course of the last 10, 15 years, looking at psychedelics as a mechanism for healing and problem solving. Those things, which are the drugs I'm particularly interested in, they have a lot of value, and they're certainly agents for re-enchanting the world.
Yeah. So there's so many things in here, so many threads that we could follow. And I just remembered that period of time when I was teetotal, I worked in a head shop, so a shop that sells paraphernalia and tarot cards, and we had a piercer out the back. And I was in there on a Sunday. And for about, I think it was about 3 months, 6 months, it was legal in the UK to sell magic mushrooms as long as they hadn't been dried out. And so we had so for that period of time, while I was teetotal, and I was actually selling mushrooms and that's like that I find hilarious to me, just to be in that situation. But yeah, it's that the shifting landscape and relationship that we have culturally and as individuals, and that sort of context and as magical practitioners. So I know that you're involved in a big conference about all of this stuff, and have been like part of some of the research into that relationship, into the healing powers of pharmacological substances. Words, suffixes are an issue currently, and all of that. Is there anything you'd like to share about that in this moment?
So part of the reason I became interested in psychedelics in particular, as well as sort of reading things like Crowley. Crowley doesn't talk that much about psychedelics because the book he wrote about it was destroyed by British customs in the 1920s. So we don't know him primarily for his psychedelic work, but what we do know is that in the last couple of decades, let's say, increasingly Euro-American and so European occulture, magical culture, pagan culture has been being informed by the indigenous traditions of the Americas in particular. And some of those traditions make use of things like peyote, this psychedelic cactus that has mescaline as its principal alkaloid, ayahuasca, I mentioned earlier, and various other kinds of substances. So one of the interesting things about these communities is that these substances are generally deployed within ceremonies. They're deployed within ritual contexts, some of which are quite elaborate, some of which are relatively simple, one might say, in their form. But for me, it was a little bit like, oh, I see now a lot of these ritual systems that I'm aware of, and a lot of these kind of techniques, if you add psychedelics to them in particular, then you get another vista opens in terms of the practice, let's say. So to take an easy example, if you have cannabis is probably the most commonly used magical herb from the point of view of the old world. So it appears in lots and lots of incense recipes in the grimoire tradition. It's mentioned actually, in the Book of Shadows as hemp. So these things are commonplace, and the fact that they consumed in these rich environments. As somebody who's interested in magic and therefore in ceremony and ritual, it was like, okay, so you bring these things together, and in order to get these psychedelics, which are it's a weird class of substance where the experience of them can take you in any number of different directions, you create a ceremony around that as a container for that experience, and then you can drive it in particular directions, within reason. You can make it a sort of ecstatic mystical experience. You can make it a sort of a healing experience. You can make it an investigation of spirit entities or whatever. Lots of different things you can do with this stuff. So in terms of the licensed research that I've been involved with, so I've been a participant in a couple of licensed experiments, both in London. And the first one was in 2019, where they were exploring the possibility of using synthetic psilocybin, so the principal active alkaloid in magic mushrooms, to investigate whether or not this could be used as a way of helping people with treatment-resistant depression, right? So there's our statement of intent. Our statement of intent, our outcome for the ritual that we're hoping for is that depressed people are less depressed, right? That we really radically help them. So that's a genuinely, a useful aim. It's all very well pointing your wand at things that probably aren't there and shouting words at that stuff, but this is it's measurable, right? We measure this. But in order to do that, you can't just give people the drugs and just sit them in a ward. What you have to do is you have to take the ward, you have to put the light level down, you have to get music, you have to curate an environment, you have to have little LED candles, you put rugs on the floor so that people don't make noise when they walk, you have individual sitters who already built a rapport with the person who's doing the journey, who will sit by the side of you, won't invade your space, but are there if you want a hand and a little bit of support. That's how you build this ceremony. So I was part of a cohort that were looking at this as we were the healthy normals, being dosed before they gave it to people with treatment-resistant depression. Spoiler alert, it does work, right? It works better than anything else there is. So in order to give this drug, you have to go and do what to me looks like magical practice. You have to create sacred space. And because I'd written some things before doing this experiment, bless them, the lovely research team came to me and said, is there anything we could have done better or different? There was nothing. There was one tiny thing I could think of, which was that I said, when you put the rugs down, you could have asked all of us who were also taking the journey to help you put the rugs down. Yeah, for the obvious reason I probably don't need to explain. So beyond that, the whole thing was brilliantly held as a ceremony, as a ceremonial practice. This is unsurprising because humans do this all the time. We're ceremony making, ritual making, metaphor inhabiting beings. We do it all the time. Our culture, our language is all dependent on this stuff. So in a way, it's not surprising. But for me as an occultist, coming into the King's College Hospital in central London, going into what to me looked like, what was absolutely this ritual space, with this particular powerful intention to test this medicine. Could you dose 6 people in a ward all at the same time? because you might want to. There's a lot of depression out there, turns out. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, funny. So this is a piece of magic and practice that I find really, really interesting. So that's one piece of the research that I've been involved with.
That's that piece about the war on drugs, right?
Hmm.
And all of the things that you're talking about. It feels to me like it's part and parcel of that attempt to break our relationship with the world and with our allies historically. Do you like, is that sort of reaching to add a story, or do you think that's a conscious or a part of the puzzle?
It's an interesting way of thinking about it. I mean, I think it's an emergent property of culture rather than a series of machinations by secret cabal, by
Oh
and
yeah,
large.
yeah.
Which I'm not suggesting that's what you're saying.
But thank
Um,
you.
uh, so I've told this story many times. It's been told by many other people, but briefly, um, the beating heart of the ancient world was the Eleusinian Mysteries, the initiation of the Eleusis, the Temple of Demeter, about 20 odd kilometers outside of ancient Athens. And this was a ritual, almost certainly a psychedelic initiation experience, 3,000 people at a time at its height, that ran for, well, since the Bronze Age. Yeah, so this is at least 1,000 years old, probably a lot longer than that. This was the big psychedelic initiation ritual. Every philosopher you've ever heard of, with the exception of Diogenes, every significant sort of member of the these ancient cultures would have gone through this initiation ritual. So this was at the heart of Mediterranean European civilization. There would have been people from as far afield as the British Isles coming to this ceremony. When this closed down for complicated and deliciously interesting reasons, which one day we'll get into the detail of as a story, because it's very interesting. But when this thing's closed down in the end of the 4th century AD, the psychedelic experience, broadly speaking, drops out of Western culture. So the pharmacological experience of having access to, which is weird because mushrooms grow all over the place, but it just becomes a non-thing within culture. Our culture, my culture, then becomes the first colonized culture that, in its madness, goes out across the world and predates on everybody else's drugs, looking for uppers and downers, things that will get you up and working at the machines, and things that will shut you up at night, right? So we want things like opium, we want things like cocaine, we want things like tobacco, we want things like sugar, we want things like tea, we want distilled alcohols. That's what we want. And anything that looks weird, when the conquistadors turn up in the Americas and start to find all these weird psychedelic drugs that people are taking, obviously these are clearly the work of the devil. Clearly the work of the devil. Some of the other ones are sort of okay. Tobacco, sort of, chocolate, that's fine. Okay, that's fine. More or less, although those go through dodgy periods, as I'm sure you know, historically. So I guess the thing is that Western culture, the culture that I come from, circumstances led to us being ripped away from this particular set of experiences, the psychedelic experiences. And those psychedelic experiences, we know from both vast amounts of anecdotal evidence and from contemporary scientific research, do things like increase people's nature relatedness. Let's take just one example. So we no longer feel so much that we are this isolated individual. We experience ourselves as connected to the web of life, particularly if we take these substances, in communal situations, we take them in nature. So is this a way of removing us from our allies? That has happened. Yes, that has happened. I think that's a perfectly reasonable way of, tracing a history. Yeah.
Possibly more as a side effect than a reason for it.
There's a long, complicated story involving the Emperor Constantine and the fact that he couldn't be initiated into the Eleusinian Mysteries. And so with his nose out of joint, he shut it down. and converted to a religion called Christianity. And the rest, as they say, is history.
That it's amazing how these linchpins can change so much. Uh, and
So the Eleusinian Mysteries, there are only two things that prevented you from being initiated. The first one was that you had to be a Greek speaker. And so Greek was the common language of the area. You know, lots of people spoke Greek as a second language. It was the sort of the English equivalent of its day. So you needed to know that because you needed to know what the hell was going on in this big ritual with 3,000 people. There's even a lost property office in the temple, which I rather like. So you had to speak Greek. And the other thing is you couldn't be a murderer. So you could actually be a member of the army, because humans have always been able to sort of section off that type of murder and say, well, that's sort of different. But you couldn't be a murderer. And unfortunately, Constantine had murdered both his wife and his son. And so they weren't prepared to initiate him.
fair enough.
And the rest, as they say, is history. So he shut it down. And with that, we've got very, very little evidence of the use of psychedelics within, Northwestern cultures. I mean, the Sami people make use of things like fly agaric mushrooms. There's maybe little hints and pieces in folklore traditions, but as a cultural phenomena, it stops. You know, and then this is the culture that goes and predates on the world for uppers and downers. This is the culture which, in its sickness, wants things to mitigate its suffering by shutting it up at the end of the day. I'll have that opium, please. I mean, Britain, as I'm sure you know, had an opium war with China because China wasn't buying enough of our stuff. You know, so we weaponized opium. So, you know, this is a very, very, it's unsurprising that this is incredibly difficult, dangerous, contested territory.
And with all of that history coming to that space, and all of what then our culture, because I'm also a Brit, like going out into the world and looking for these uppers and downers, these things to keep us producing and to soothe that pain and fill that hole.
If you take the example of, you spoke about being teetotal as a response to the difficulties that you saw around you, people having these difficult relationships with alcohol.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we know from the perspective of what's sometimes called psychedelic assisted therapy or healing work with psychedelics is that we know that those substances can be used to help people with alcohol addictions. So I had a friend a few years ago who was doing some licensed research in the British Isles, and they had a cohort of about 30 or so people who were all chronic alcoholics, been alcoholics for decades. And they managed to sort of reduce the alcohol consumption as best as they possibly could. And then they went in for a program of some psychotherapy and some MDMA, some ecstasy sessions. Everybody stopped drinking. Everybody stopped drinking. And in fact, it's even more astonishing than that. Some people went back to very occasionally socially drinking. We've got longitudinal data for this. So these substances are really good ways of sorting your head out. They're really good ways of seeing the problems that we all have as humans from a new perspective, which means you can step out of the habitual pattern of numbing yourself with alcohol. It's the most common, it's the most easily produced the drugs, pretty much. So if we can do that for individuals, isn't it interesting that the culture that no longer had access to that mental state and those experiences became the culture that then wandered around the world looking for uppers and downers? And had it only eaten the medicine, the mushrooms that grew in its own backyard, it might not have been so mental.
Yeah. I mean, there's a reason that they're called magic, right?
Yes. I mean, it's that blindingly obvious. And for people who are sort of watching this, listening to this, of course, this is about a relationship. We have to be thoughtful. We have to be thoughtful about the legal context in which we find ourselves. We have to be thoughtful about the environmental context, our health, all of the things. but there are really very interesting opportunities to be had with these substances. So, for example, I mentioned that cannabis is one of the substances that appears in all the way through what academics call the Western magical tradition. So, cannabis in the British Isles, you can be prescribed to that. You can go and get a private prescription for cannabis. I have a prescription that I have for both insomnia and late-stage capitalist ennui, and
Yeah.
I'm serious.
No.
So
Is that what's actually written on the prescription? Because like
it's not written on them. I think they gave me it on the basis of insomnia.
but that's what it's for, right?
I did. That's what those are the symptoms I presented with. So this is the substance for those people who've taken cannabis. Now you can do it recreationally, and that's great. I don't have a problem with this. Do it for fun. Watch Netflix or whatever it is people get up to doing. It's fantastic, great fun. Go for a walk in the woods, brilliant. You can create a container. You can create a ceremony around cannabis. There are various people. I work with a guy called Richard Tyo, Tyo. Richard Tyo is a Canadian therapist, and obviously in the promised land of Canada, it's even more accessible than it is here in Britain. So he does sort of both in-person and online cannabis ceremonies, and people have these really big experiences, these really powerful transformative experiences with something that can equally be used in a very sort of low-key recreational sense. So there you have an example. You can have alcohol that you drink to the point of excess and it damages you, and it's a way of mitigating your suffering and so on. You can have the alcohol, which is just a small amount with your dinner, and that's really nice. It's enjoyable. Maybe you're ever so slightly drunk, and that's great. And then you have the alcohol in the cakes and wine ceremony, right? These are all the same thing. It's just a question of the container, sometimes literally the container in which the alcohol sits. Here it's still going to be just in the bottle of vodka with the cap off, and that's all we get. Here it's going to be like a nice glass of red wine with your meal, or a brandy after dinner, something like this. And here it's going to be in a chalice that we raise aloft, that maybe we dedicate as the starfire of the goddess. It's the same thing. The difference is the enchantment.
Yeah. And that I love that, because that's that enchantment as relationship.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a piece, so I mentioned before we started that I was in your workshop on it was the shape of sounds, right?
Oh yes, yes,
And
yes.
the how and the sounds of shapes. And you're just reminding me of that with the container that the alcohol is held in, right? Speaks to us, means something to us independently of the content.
Mm, mm.
And like the shape of the shape of an object tells us something about, like, there's a sound, there's a vibration there. I know it's not quite the same thing, but there are these.
No. There's
right?
I can do a link. I can do a link. Right. So when we take psychedelics, one of the things that happens, and when we enter altered states of consciousness, whether we do it with pharmacology or funny breathing or ritual drama or protracted periods of ecstatic sex or whatever it happens to be, one of the things that happens is that we create new novel neuronal connections in our brain. That's one way of describing it, right? So these novel connections arise subjectively as new metaphors, new ways of understanding things. When people have psychedelic therapy and they have their trauma that's led to their alcoholism, and then they have their MDMA, they have a big visionary experience, they haven't forgotten the trauma. What's happened is they've understood it in a new way. They've made a new connection. So human beings have all of these connections. Many of them are sort of, they're there, and they're actually obvious if you pay them attention. But again, it's about listening. So in that workshop that I was doing, there's this thing called the non-arbitrary relationship between shape and sound. Yeah, sounds have a shape. If I draw my hand like this, we know what shape that is. That's that sort of curvy, sinuous line, and it has a kind of shape. Yeah. So we have examples from psychology. There's a thing called the Buber and Kiki effect, and this is to do with this understanding of the kind of the deep layers of the self, the biology that we are, and understanding those things like if one of the things about magic is it's understanding the hidden laws or hidden processes in the universe, that's a hidden process, right? So a hidden process is the fact that I can draw a spiky shape and it'll have in your head a certain range of sounds, or a round shape will have a series of, it's hard to even round shapes. If we are working in ceremony, for example, let's imagine that we're doing a ceremony where, whatever the vibe is for the ceremony, whatever the flavor is for that time of year or that energy or that spirit or whatever, we can find words, we can find shapes that kind of tune in on that frequency. But we can only find those things if we listen to this kind of deep structure that's within us as human beings. Sometimes we find these things in books, and we find that somebody's articulated quite a nice sort of way of understanding these ideas. But fundamentally, I think that the thing about magic is that we have to do it for ourselves. The magician is the second card in the deck that stands there in front of the table with all the bits and bobs, right? All the magic bling. And I think, obviously, there's a lot of ink that has been passed through pens about the difference between religion and magic. But one way of certainly thinking about what magic as a practice, or what we could call kind of, inhabited pagan experimental spirituality, all these sorts of things, is they're about trying stuff out for yourself, rather than taking a text and simply reproducing it, taking it and assuming that that must be the answer. It's about discovering it for yourself. So again, in that workshop, what I was doing is I was putting up a series of signs with shapes, weird shapes, and then I was inviting people to decode those shapes into the sound value that they felt that they were, and then using that as a trance induction tool in order to place an intention into the universe. So this, again, rather like the work with psychedelics, is all about this relational process. How can we see the relationship between color and sound? When we have psychedelics, for example, again, whether we do that with chemistry or other practices, we get synesthesia. We get these kind of strange and unusual cross linkages of sensories that don't normally talk to each other for most people most of the time. So we've got our eyes closed and we listen to the music, and we see these astonishing fractal forms emerging. Why do we see fractals? Well, part of the reason we see fractals is because all of biology is built on fractals, and including all the biology inside your brain. So what we're seeing is these underlying pattern structures. We're seeing the edge detection system in the eye. We're seeing the depth perception system, and we're seeing them start to talk to bits of the brain that are perceiving sound. And then they generate these new relationships. And for me, that's magic.
And I love that there's that piece in there that magic isn't about knowing lots of stuff and thinking about lots of things. It's about that being in that experience and doing the thing and finding those relationships and those connections for yourself. Oh.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just guessing along with everybody else, but yeah, that's what it seems to me. That's how it seems to me.
That's how you seem to have experienced it. Yeah. It resonates with my experience. There is a relationship between those two things.
I'm glad.
Oh, thank you so much, Julian. This has been absolutely delightful and fascinating, as I knew it would be. So, is there anything that you'd like to say to finish up? And I like to invite my guests to share a practical thing that people can go away and do. So obviously within the bounds of legality, given the topic.
Yes, of course.
I trust you. I trust you. So yeah, like any last thoughts on what should people go away and do after all of this?
Well, again, just to say thank you very much for inviting me. It's been really great. I think everyone's got the memo about go outside and touch the grass.
Yes.
So what I would say actually is I would say do your practices, whatever the practice happens to be, working with the tarot, working with anything else, but experiment with probably the simplest way of entering an altered state of awareness, which is to control the breath. So probably people would be familiar with things like holotropic breath work, and maybe they've come across sort of Wim Hof stuff and so on. But playing with the breath is probably the most useful tool for navigating altered states of consciousness and indeed inducing them. So the breath that is often one that people like to use, and one that comes naturally and automatically when we do mantras or singing, is what's sometimes called a connected breath. So that's a breath that comes in and out like a wave with no pause, no stopping of the wave. So you might, for example, decide that you're going to, let's take something really simple. I'm teaching tomorrow about magical practice with the tarot. So you just get a tarot card and maybe pick one at random. That'd be nice. It's often a good choice. And you decide that you want to connect in with the energy of this card, the quality of this card. You want to understand it more deeply. You want to develop your relationship between you and this image and all the things that it might be imagined to contain or represent. So you put the card in front of you, you can just stare at the card, that's great. But if you use a connected breath and you spend at least 20 minutes doing the practice, I'll explain in a moment why 20 minutes matters. What you'll find is that this allows you to drop into this really interesting, like gently altered state of consciousness. The deeper you make the breath, and to some extent, the faster you make the breath, the more intense that experience will become. So do have a read around about this stuff. There's a lovely book by a guy called David Lee called Life Force, which is all about breath work, which you might want to check out. There's plenty of resources online. But just experiment with that simple way of changing the levels of carbon dioxide and oxygen in your body, because that will create a series of endogenous inside changes. And if you do it for 20 minutes, and 20 minutes is a general good rule of thumb for most practices, because it takes, to cut a long story short, it takes our brain 20 minutes to process this moment now. So that moment now, we have to wait 20 minutes for all of the data that was contained in that experience to go through. It's rather like saying if you went to a gallery, if you stood in front of a painting for 20 minutes, your brain has finished processing the previous painting, and now you're actually looking at the painting completely. So 20 minutes is a good rule of thumb for lots and lots of practices, meditation, many other things. How long you need to stay still in a woodland before the creatures get on with their day and stop worrying about you, the weird monkey. So do your practice and maybe experiment with this idea of putting a connected breath into it, and just do it for at least 20 minutes and see what happens. Good luck.
I love that. And that's like playing with substances of oxygen and carbon dioxide, just that is there.
Yeah.
Oh, beautiful. Thank you. I'm going to adopt the moniker Weird Monkey for all of about 20 minutes and then I'll forget. So where can folk find your work? Where are you likely to be next?
Well, I'm going to be, over the course of the autumn time, I'll be doing a number of bits of online teaching, the College of Psychic Studies, and also with Treadwell's books. Particularly for perhaps people in the United States, I'll be doing, or the Americas, I should say. I'll be doing some teaching with an organization called Morbid Anatomy. So this is all online stuff. I'm going to be doing some in-person things. Going to be speaking at the Occulture conference in Berlin in, I think it's October time.
Yeah.
And my website is dead easy. It's just julianvayne.com. I'm available on social media as well. Instagram is quite nice. Quite like that. Lots of pictures. Very good.
Yeah, I like Instagram. I like the pretty pictures. Yeah. Brilliant. Well, I will put the link to your website in the description. Thank you again so much for being here and being in relationship with me and stepping into relationship with our listeners and inviting us to do the same with the world.
Thank you very, very much, Helen. Most appreciated.
You're very welcome. So to everybody listening, thank you for being here. Thank you for coming and joining us. And if you would like to join in the conversation about this, then have a go at that connected breathing with all of that in mind, with whatever your practice is, and then come and share what went on, what happened, what was different for you in the comments for this episode. Or you can come and join the conversation in the Enchanted Academy, the online free community that I run, where we've got multiple online free monthly classes and circles and things on various topics, including fairies and kinky magic and random specialist magical topics as well. So you'd be very welcome to come and chat there. Links below. But until next time, may your world be enchanted. May your path be filled with healthy and delightful relationships. And may the substances that you encounter treat you well as you treat them well. Take care, everybody.